Boy returns from death with a shocking message from heaven. It was a sunny Tuesday afternoon when Ben's life took a sudden and terrifying turn. His mother, Emily, had just finished setting up a picnic in the backyard. The air was warm and filled with the scent of blooming flowers. And Ben, like most 6-year-olds, was bursting with energy. He ran across the lawn with his toy plane, making swooping noises as he pretended to soar through the sky. Emily smiled as she watched her little boy play, completely unaware of the strange and dramatic series of events about to unfold. Suddenly, Ben stopped mid-run, clutching his chest. His face twisted in confusion and discomfort. He tried to take a breath, but it seemed like the air just wouldn't come. Emily's heart dropped. She rushed over to him, but before she could reach him, Ben collapsed onto the soft green grass. The toy plane rolled out of his hand, forgotten. In that split second, the playful atmosphere turned into a scene of horror. Emily's mind raced, unable to comprehend what she was seeing. Just moments ago, her son was playing happily, and now he lay still, his small body limp on the ground. Panicked, she screamed for her husband, Mark, who was inside the house. He came running out, his face contorted in fear. Together, they carried Ben inside, barely able to process what was happening. Mark dialed 911 with shaking hands, trying to stay calm as he described his son's sudden collapse. Within minutes, the sound of sirens filled the air, shattering the quiet suburban peace. Paramedics rushed into the house, their faces set with a practiced urgency. They lifted Ben onto a stretcher, checking his pulse, shining a light into his eyes, and speaking to each other in clipped professional tones that made the whole situation feel even more surreal. In the ambulance, as they sped towards the hospital, one of the paramedics squeezed an oxygen mask onto Ben's tiny face. He had no pulse. The paramedics began chest compressions, their movements quick and methodical. But Emily could see the worry in their eyes. It was as if time slowed down and every second dragged on endlessly. The only sound was the relentless wail of the siren, echoing the desperate beat of Emily's own racing heart. When they arrived at the hospital, Ben was whisked away into the emergency room. Emily and Mark were left in the sterile white hallway, holding onto each other, barely able to breathe. A doctor emerged briefly, his face grim. "We're doing everything we can," he said, before disappearing behind the heavy double doors. It felt like hours, though it was only minutes. And then, just when Emily thought she couldn't take it anymore, the doctor returned with a different expression on his face, one of cautious hope. "We got him back," the doctor said. "He was gone for about a minute, but we were able to resuscitate him." Relief washed over Emily and Mark like a tidal wave. They clutched each other, tears streaming down their faces, not yet knowing that Ben's journey during that lost minute would be the beginning of an even stranger tale. When Ben opened his eyes, the first thing he did was smile. It wasn't the kind of groggy, confused awakening his parents had expected. He seemed serene, almost joyful. He looked up at the fluorescent lights, blinking as if adjusting to the brightness, then turned his gaze to his parents. He didn't seem frightened or disoriented. Instead, he looked like a boy who had just woken up from a pleasant nap. "Mommy," he said, his voice still weak but filled with an unusual calm. "I saw God." The room fell silent. The nurses, who had been busy checking his vitals, paused to look at each other. Emily and Mark exchanged a puzzled glance, unsure how to react. They had heard stories of near-death experiences before, visions of white lights and loved ones waiting on the other side. but they had never expected their own child to come back with such a claim. "You saw God?" Emily asked, her voice tinged with disbelief. Ben nodded, his eyes wide and earnest. "He was really big, like a giant. He was nice, though. He talked to me." His voice was filled with the innocent confidence of a child who believes everything he says should be taken at face value. "What did he say?" Mark asked, trying to humor his son, thinking it was just a fanciful dream brought on by the trauma. Ben's expression grew serious, and he furrowed his brow as if he were trying to remember something important. "He told me about heaven. It's beautiful there, with big golden gates and angels that sing all the time." He paused, looking directly into his mother's eyes, his next words delivered with a solemnity that seemed almost beyond his years. "But he said some people can't go in." Emily felt a chill run down her spine. "What do you mean, Ben? Who can't go in?" "Eastern Europeans," Ben said simply, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "God told me they're not allowed in heaven." For a moment, there was silence. Emily and Mark stared at their son, trying to process what he had just said. The absurdity of it left them speechless. A nurse who had been listening gave a startled laugh, then quickly covered her mouth, realizing it was inappropriate. But Ben didn't seem to notice. He looked up at them with wide, innocent eyes, as if expecting them to simply accept what he had just told them. "Why would God say that?" Mark finally managed to ask, struggling to keep his voice steady. Ben shrugged. "I don't know. He just said it's a rule. They can't come in." It was the conviction in Ben's voice that made the whole thing so unsettling. He wasn't joking or making it up for attention. He spoke with the unwavering certainty of a child who has been told something by an authority figure and accepts it as an unshakable truth. Emily felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She wanted to brush it off as the result of a fevered imagination or a bizarre dream, but there was something about the way Ben looked at her, so earnest and sure, that made it hard to dismiss. As the doctors continued their examinations, Ben's story didn't change. He spoke about the bright light, the angels, the overwhelming feeling of peace, and, most notably, the startling revelation about Eastern Europeans. It wasn't a detail he threw in casually. He repeated it with the same solemnity every time, as though it were a fundamental part of his experience. The medical staff was left puzzled and slightly amused. They had seen patients come back from the brink of death with stories of tunnels of light and encounters with deceased loved ones, but never anything quite like this. One of the nurses, trying to lighten the mood, joked to Emily, "Well, I guess heaven has its own immigration policy now." Emily forced a smile, but she couldn't shake the strange, nagging feeling in her chest. She had 1,000 questions racing through her mind. Was this just a dream? A child's mind trying to make sense of a traumatic experience? Or had Ben truly seen something beyond their understanding? And if so, why on earth would his vision include such a bizarre and specific detail? As she sat there, holding Ben's small hand, she realized that whatever had happened during that lost minute, it had changed her son in some profound way. And whether she believed his story or not, she couldn't deny the look of absolute certainty in his eyes. As the days passed after Ben's recovery, his strange declaration became a topic of conversation that his parents couldn't seem to escape. At first, Emily and Mark tried to brush it off as the product of a vivid imagination. After all, Ben was just a child. and children say the darndest things, especially after a traumatic experience. But Ben's insistence on his heavenly vision and the specifics of his message were impossible to ignore. It wasn't just the story itself, it was the way he told it, with a kind of gravity and certainty that was unlike anything his parents had ever seen in him before. Ben seemed different somehow. It wasn't that he had changed in any dramatic, visible way, but there was a newfound seriousness about him. He was still playful and full of energy, but when he spoke about his near-death experience, he did so with the calm assurance of someone who had seen the truth. It was as if he had been let in on a secret that no one else knew, and he couldn't understand why everyone else was having such a hard time believing him. Whenever the topic came up, Ben would sit up straight, his face taking on a solemn expression. "I was in heaven," he'd say, as if it were a simple fact. "I saw God. He's very big, and his voice is like thunder, but not scary." He would pause, his tiny brow furrowing in concentration as he recalled the details. "The angels sing all the time. They're very happy. But no one from Eastern Europe can go in, God told me." Emily tried several times to get him to clarify what he meant, but his answer was always the same. "God just said they can't come in. They have to stay outside. It's a rule." He spoke about it the same way he might talk about the rule at school that kids can't run in the hallway. It wasn't up for debate, it was just the way things were. Word of Ben's story quickly spread beyond the family. At first, it was just a funny anecdote shared among friends and neighbors, something to laugh about in the grocery store or at the park. "Did you hear about Emily's kid?" one mum would say to another, shaking her head with a smile. "He says he went to heaven and saw God, and that God told him no Eastern Europeans are allowed in. Can you believe it?" But as more people heard the story, the reactions began to shift. Some found it amusing, a harmless and silly tale from the mouth of a child. Others, however, were unsettled. It wasn't that they took the message itself seriously. It was more the fact that Ben seemed so adamant, so completely convinced of what he had seen. It was hard to dismiss a story when it was told with such pure, unwavering conviction. One day, the local pastor, Father Michael, paid a visit to the house. He had heard about Ben's experience through the grapevine and wanted to speak to the boy himself. He approached it with an open mind, curious but skeptical. After all, he had heard many stories of near-death experiences throughout his years in the ministry, bright lights, feelings of peace, reunions with loved ones. But this was different. He had never heard of a child coming back with a divine message so specific, so oddly exclusionary. Father Michael sat down with Ben in the living room, offering him a gentle smile. "Your mum and dad told me you had a very special experience," he said. "You went to heaven." Ben nodded eagerly. "Yes, I did. I saw God." Father Michael's smile faltered slightly. "And what did he tell you, Ben?" Ben's expression turned serious. "He told me that people from Eastern Europe aren't allowed in. They can't come into heaven. They have to wait outside." Father Michael blinked, caught off guard. He wasn't sure what he had expected, but it wasn't this. "Why do you think he would say that?" he asked gently. Ben just shrugged. "I don't know. It's just a rule. God said so." The pastor leaned back, trying to keep his expression neutral. "That's very interesting, Ben. Do you remember anything else? Anything about why some people might not be let in?" Ben shook his head. No, he didn't say why, just that they can't come in. Father Michael left the house that day feeling uneasy. He knew it was just a child's story, a strange and fanciful tale born out of a near-death experience. But he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to it. The conviction in Ben's voice, the way he spoke about God as though he had truly been in his presence. It was unsettling. He had heard stories before, but this one seemed to linger in his mind long after he walked out the door. The next Sunday at church, Father Michael shared Ben's story during his sermon, trying to frame it as a humorous anecdote about the imaginative power of children. He chuckled as he told the congregation about the boy's vision of heaven and the strange exclusion of Eastern Europeans. But he noticed the reaction wasn't what he had expected. Some of the parishioners laughed along, but others exchanged uncomfortable glances. A few sat stone-faced, their expressions unreadable. After the service, an older woman approached him, her brow furrowed. "Father, do you think it's possible that the boy really did see something?" she asked. "I mean, could it be a sign?" Father Michael hesitated. He didn't want to dismiss her concerns outright, but he also didn't want to encourage any kind of xenophobic interpretation of the story. "I think it's more likely that it's just a child's imagination at work," he said carefully. "But it is interesting, isn't it? How he seems so sure of what he saw." The story continued to spread, taking on a life of its own. Some people were angry, feeling that Ben's tale was offensive or discriminatory, even though it was coming from a 6-year-old. "What kind of nonsense is this?" one man complained at the local coffee shop. "A kid says he saw heaven, and suddenly we're supposed to believe that God has a problem with Eastern Europeans. It's ridiculous." Others, however, found themselves oddly captivated by the story. There was something about it that they couldn't quite dismiss, even if they wanted to. It wasn't that they believed the message itself, necessarily. It was the fact that it came from a child, one who had been through a near-death experience and come back with a vision that was so oddly specific. People started to wonder if there was a deeper meaning behind it, something symbolic that they weren't understanding. Conspiracy theories began to pop up online. In local forums and Facebook groups, people speculated about what Ben's vision might really mean. "Maybe it's a sign of the end times," one commenter suggested. "A warning about a great divide between nations." Others thought it might be a coded message, a metaphor for something political or cultural. "The kid is speaking in symbols," another post read. "It's not about actual Eastern Europeans, it's about exclusion, about the barriers we create between each other. It's a message from God through the mouth of a child." In the midst of it all, Ben remained blissfully unaware of the stir his story was causing. To him, it was simple. He had seen heaven. He had spoken to God. And God had told him something important, something he felt he had to share, no matter how strange it sounded. He didn't understand why adults kept asking him the same questions over and over, why they seemed so confused by what he was saying. In his mind, it was just the truth. He had been there. He knew what he had seen. For Emily and Mark, the whole situation was becoming overwhelming. They wanted to protect their son, to shield him from the confusion and controversy his story had sparked. But every time they tried to downplay it, Ben would look up at them with those wide, innocent eyes and say, "But it's true, Mummy. I promise. God told me." And in those moments, despite their best efforts to be rational, they couldn't help but wonder, what if he really did see something? What if, for just one brief moment, their little boy had glimpsed a piece of the divine? Ben's story had become the talk of the town, and soon it was no longer just a local curiosity. The tale of the little boy who claimed he'd been to heaven and returned with a message about Eastern Europeans not being allowed through the pearly gates spread like wildfire. What started as hushed conversations among neighbors turned into discussions in church groups, debates on local radio stations, and even the subject of a feature in the regional newspaper. Emily and Mark had hoped the buzz would die down, but instead it only seemed to grow. Ben's parents received phone calls from distant relatives they hadn't spoken to in years, all wanting to know more about the boy's experience. "Is it true?" Aunt Sharon asked over the phone, her voice hushed as if she were discussing something sacred. "Did he really say God told him that Eastern Europeans can't go to heaven?" Mark tried to play it off, laughing nervously. "You know how kids are," he said. "They have such vivid imaginations." But even as he spoke the words, he knew it wasn't enough to convince her or himself. The situation took a stranger turn when a local news crew showed up on their doorstep. A young reporter with a bright smile and an eager look in her eyes asked if she could interview Ben. "We've heard about his incredible story," she said, barely able to contain her excitement. "It's so unusual and fascinating. We think our viewers would love to hear about his experience firsthand." Emily hesitated. The last thing she wanted was to turn her son into a spectacle. But before she could politely decline, Ben appeared in the doorway, looking up at the reporter with a curious expression. "You want to hear about heaven?" he asked. The reporter's face lit up. "Yes, I'd love to. Can you tell me what you saw?" Without a hint of hesitation, Ben launched into his story. He described the golden gates, the angels singing, the overwhelming feeling of peace. And then, with the same solemn expression he always wore when recounting his experience, he delivered his key message. "God told me that people from Eastern Europe aren't allowed in. They have to stay outside." The reporter's smile faltered for a moment, a flicker of confusion crossing her face. She clearly hadn't expected this twist. "Oh, I see," she said, trying to keep her voice light. "And did God say why?" Ben shook his head. "No, he just said it's a rule. They can't come in." The interview aired later that night, and the reaction was immediate. The local news station's phone lines lit up with calls from viewers. Some people were laughing, treating it as a bizarre but funny story. "Only a kid could come up with something like that," one caller chuckled. But others were angry, accusing the news station of promoting xenophobia and prejudice, even if it was coming from a 6-year-old boy. "This is inappropriate," one woman fumed. "Why would you air something like this? It's offensive." The backlash took Emily and Mark by surprise. They had never intended for Ben's story to become a public controversy. They just wanted to make sense of what their son had experienced and help him process it in a healthy way. Now, it felt like the entire town was involved, each person projecting their own interpretations and opinions onto the innocent words of a child who had simply tried to describe what he believed he had seen. One day, a group of Eastern European immigrants who lived in the community decided to confront Emily and Mark about the situation. They were polite but firm, their faces lined with concern. "We don't understand why your son would say something like this," one woman, a Ukrainian named Alina, said. "We come to church, we pray, we try to be good people. Why would God exclude us?" Emily felt her face flush with embarrassment. "I'm so sorry," she stammered. "He's just a little boy. I don't know why he said it. He's only telling us what he believes he saw." Alina's expression softened slightly, but she still looked troubled. "It's just, hard to hear, you know. We've faced so much already, coming to a new country, trying to fit in. And now, to hear that even in heaven, we're not welcome. It's painful. The encounter left Emily feeling more confused and helpless than ever. She wanted to comfort Alina, to assure her that her son's words were meaningless, that there was no truth behind them. But deep down, a small part of her couldn't help but wonder, what if there was something more to it? What if Ben really had seen something beyond their comprehension? Religious leaders in the area started weighing in on the matter, each with their own interpretations. Father Michael, who had spoken to Ben early on, tried to downplay the controversy in his Sunday sermon. "We must remember," he said gently to the congregation, "that children see the world in a unique way. They interpret their experiences through the lens of their limited understanding. Ben's story is not a declaration of divine truth, but a reflection of his imagination and the way he processes the world around him." But not everyone agreed with Father Michael's take. A visiting preacher at a neighboring church delivered a fiery sermon the following week, proclaiming that Ben's vision was a warning from God. "The Lord speaks through the mouths of babes," he declared, his voice echoing through the sanctuary. "This boy's vision is a message for us all. It's a call to purify our hearts and our communities. We must ask ourselves why God might say such a thing. What sins are we harboring that might keep us from his kingdom?" The crowd murmured in agreement, a ripple of unease spreading through the room. The preacher's words seemed to strike a chord, tapping into a well of anxiety and fear that had been bubbling beneath the surface. Suddenly, Ben's innocent story had become a symbol, a rallying cry for those who believed it was a divine sign of something greater. The story caught the attention of a local radio host who invited callers to share their thoughts on the air. The segment quickly became one of the most heated debates the show had ever seen. "I think it's ridiculous," one caller scoffed. "It's just a kid making things up. Why are we even talking about this?" But another caller, her voice thick with emotion, countered, "You don't understand. My family is from Poland, and when I heard what that boy said, it felt like a knife in my heart. It's like we're being judged all over again, even in the afterlife." The debate spilled over onto social media, where the story went viral. Hashtags like Ben Saw God and Each Heaven Gatekeepers began trending, with people from all over the country chiming in with their opinions. Some users made jokes, sharing memes about God standing at the gates of heaven with a no-entry sign for Eastern Europeans. Others, however, took it far more seriously, sharing personal stories of feeling excluded or unwelcome in their own communities. Emily found herself scrolling through the comments late at night, unable to tear her eyes away from the flood of opinions. Some were kind, offering support and understanding, but many were harsh, criticizing her and Mark for allowing their son's story to spread. "This is irresponsible parenting," one commenter wrote. "They should have kept this private instead of letting a child's imagination cause so much pain." Mark tried to comfort her, putting his arm around her shoulders as she stared at her phone. "It'll blow over," he said softly. "People will move on to the next thing soon enough." But Emily wasn't so sure. She glanced over at the couch, where Ben was playing quietly with his toys, completely oblivious to the storm his story had unleashed. He was still just a little boy with his innocent smile and wide, curious eyes. Yet, somehow, he had become the center of a controversy he couldn't possibly understand. A controversy that had taken on a life of its own, far beyond the simple tale of a child who believed he had seen a glimpse of the divine. As the weeks went on, it became clear that Ben's story wasn't going to fade into the background as quickly as his parents had hoped. The more they tried to downplay it, the more it seemed to take on a life of its own, spiraling into something they could no longer control. It was as if Ben's tale had tapped into a deep, unspoken fear or longing that resonated with people in unexpected ways. Emily and Mark found themselves caught in a whirlwind, fielding calls and messages from strangers, religious leaders, journalists, and even self-proclaimed spiritual gurus who believed Ben's vision held a hidden truth waiting to be uncovered. In the midst of the chaos, Ben himself remained strangely calm. If anything, he seemed to thrive on the attention, not in a boastful way, but with a kind of serene acceptance. It was as if he had been given a mission, a message to share, and he took it seriously. He didn't shy away when people asked him to tell his story again and again. In fact, he seemed to grow more confident each time he recounted it, his voice clear and unwavering, his eyes wide with the memory of what he believed he had seen. A few weeks after the initial media frenzy, a well-known televangelist got wind of the story and reached out to the family. His name was Reverend Paul Jensen, a charismatic figure with a large following and a reputation for dramatic sermons that drew crowds by the thousands. He was known for his fiery proclamations and his tendency to frame current events as signs of the approaching end times. When he heard about Ben's vision, he saw it as an opportunity too good to pass up. He called the family, offering to fly them out to his megachurch for a special service where Ben could share his experience with his massive congregation. Emily was hesitant. The idea of putting her young son on such a public stage made her uneasy, but Mark was intrigued. He had watched Jensen's show a few times and knew how influential the man was. "Maybe this is a chance for us to set the record straight," he said to Emily. "We can help people understand that it's just a child's story, not something to take so seriously." Reluctantly, Emily agreed. They flew out to Texas, where Jensen's church, a sprawling complex with a capacity of over 10,000 people, was filled to the brim with worshippers eager to hear Ben's story. The atmosphere was electric, the crowd buzzing with anticipation. On stage, Reverend Jensen introduced the family, his voice booming through the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, "we have a very special guest today. This young boy, just 6 years old, has been to the other side and back. He has seen the face of God and returned with a message we all need to hear." Ben was brought on stage, looking small and vulnerable in the spotlight. But as he took the microphone, his expression changed. The nervousness melted away, replaced by that same calm certainty that had unnerved his parents so many times before. He spoke clearly, recounting his journey to heaven, the golden gates, the angels singing, and, of course, the exclusion of Eastern Europeans. The congregation was silent, hanging on his every word. Reverend Jensen stood beside him, nodding solemnly, his face a mask of concern and reverence. "You see, folks," he said when Ben finished, "the Lord works in mysterious ways. He sends us signs and messages through the most unlikely of messengers, even a child like Ben. This vision is a warning, a call to repentance. We must ask ourselves why God might have delivered such a message. What sins are we harboring in our hearts that could lead to such a judgment?" The crowd erupted in a murmur of agreement, some nodding fervently, others wiping tears from their eyes. For them, Ben's story had become more than just a strange tale. It was a prophecy, a divine revelation delivered through the innocent lips of a child. As Emily watched from the side of the stage, she felt a deep unease settle in her chest. This wasn't what she had wanted. It wasn't what she had expected. Her son had become a symbol, a tool for others to wield in their own narratives. After the service, Reverend Jensen pulled the family aside, his expression grave. "I believe your son has been chosen," he said, his voice low. "This is no coincidence. He has been given a gift, a vision from God himself. I want to help you share his message with the world." Emily felt a flash of anger rise up, hot and sudden. "He's just a little boy," she snapped. "He doesn't even understand what he's saying. He's not a prophet. He's not a messenger. He's just a child who had a strange dream." Jensen's expression softened, taking on a paternal tone. "I understand your concern, but you must see that this is bigger than any of us. People are searching for answers. They're looking for signs. Your son could be the answer they've been praying for." Emily pulled Ben close, wrapping her arm protectively around his shoulders. "We're done here," she said firmly, turning away. Mark hesitated, looking between his wife and the preacher, torn between wanting to protect his family and the allure of the larger purpose Jensen seemed to offer. But in the end, he followed Emily, his face set in a grim frown. Back at home, things didn't settle down. The media attention only intensified after their appearance at Jensen's church. Their phone rang day and night, reporters asking for statements, religious groups wanting Ben to speak at their events. A documentary filmmaker even approached them, proposing a film about Ben's experience and its impact on the community. Emily refused it all, trying to shield her son from the growing storm. But it was like trying to hold back a tidal wave with her bare hands. The story had taken on a life of its own, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Ben, for his part, seemed unfazed by the chaos swirling around him. He went back to his usual activities, playing with his toys, going to school, and chattering about his favorite cartoons. But every now and then, he would say something that sent a chill down Emily's spine. One evening, as they were sitting at the dinner table, he looked up suddenly and said, "Mommy, you know God told me something else too. He said there will be a big change soon. Something's going to happen and people need to get ready." Emily froze, her fork halfway to her mouth. "What do you mean, Ben? What kind of change?" Ben just shrugged, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. "I don't know. He just said it's going to be different soon." Mark looked at his wife, his face pale. "Maybe it's just more of his imagination," he whispered, but even he didn't sound convinced. As the months passed, the furor around Ben's story slowly began to die down. People moved on to the next big thing, and the calls and visits dwindled. But the impact lingered, rippling out in subtle ways. Emily noticed that some of their Eastern European neighbors no longer smiled at them in the grocery store. At church, there was a new tension in the air, an undercurrent of unease that hadn't been there before. People whispered as they passed by, glancing at Ben with a mix of awe and suspicion. In the quiet moments when she lay awake at night, listening to the sound of her son's soft breathing, Emily wondered what it all meant. Was it just a child's fantasy, spun out of a brush with death and a vivid imagination? Or had Ben truly seen something beyond their understanding? She didn't know, and she wasn't sure she ever would. In the end, the only thing she knew for certain was that their lives had been irrevocably changed by that single, fleeting minute when Ben's heart had stopped beating. Whatever he had seen, whatever he had experienced in that brief moment on the edge of life and death, it had left a mark on him, and on everyone who heard his story. And that, she realized with a shiver, was something she would have to live with for the rest of her life.